Hi, welcome to the Reboot Loading Podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie. Hello, everyone. On today's episode, I am here with Julia Donald, and we are going to be discussing the pros and cons of working in startup environments versus enterprise or larger companies. So I want to welcome Julia to the Reboot Loading Podcast. Hi, Julia.
Hi, Stephanie. Thank you so much for having me. And this is a great topic.
I've seen a lot of people just over the past months throughout my own layoff and seeing people getting jobs from a startup environment into something larger and hearing the differences. You having been in both types of environments, I've been in both types of environments. You know, it's interesting to see the different sides. So tell me a little bit about you, how you got to where you are right now.
Gosh, I mean, a lot of it was a little bit of an accidental journey. I went to college for English and didn't really know what I was going to do with it after that, and started doing practice interviews at my college, and a plumbing supply chain company hired me to do sales and management trainee program. And I said, that's great. I need money. You're going to give me money. You're my only job offer. And they started me off in the warehouse to learn supply chain from the beginning. And within week 3, we were doing the first WMS implementation for that company. And it was just beautifully broken. And I really fell in love with how do you implement a system and how do you track inventory that moves and how you measure the performance. I was emailing headquarters every day with a list of bugs and how I thought we should fix them. And I didn't realize also that they were like VPs I was emailing. Mm-hmm. And they were like, how about you come join our team and be the operations analyst for this project that has 100 sites to launch in the next 2 years. And wow. I said, that sounds great. Did that for 2 years. And this was like 2005 through 2007. Mm-hmm. And I loved that. And I moved around the whole country. And then the housing industry busted. And I saw it in the numbers that I was running. And I pivoted really quickly to moving to support team. And like the next month, the whole team was laid off.
Oh, no.
And so I took that time to learn the tech side of, like how do I query SQL? How do I support, networks? How do I configure RF devices? And that kind of got me through the downturn until I could move to a 3PL. At a 3PL, I learned like true systems analysis. I supported big enterprise companies, but it was a private company that allowed me to have, they took more of a risk on me than like an enterprise would at that time. And then I knew kind of as the economy was recovering that I wanted to switch from supporting all these companies to working deeply in one company at a time. Like I was wearing a lot of hats at the private company, which was great for quick growth, but I wanted to go really deep. Mm-hmm. And I had traveled the whole country and I wanted to move to Seattle. So I applied for a lot of Pacific Northwest companies and got one to take a risk on me. Mm-hmm. And I moved cross country and did that for 8 years, just really deep in one company, learning supply chain end to end. But I came to a point where I realized I loved learning like the robotics. I loved learning different WMS packages, but I wasn't sure where to go from there. Like I either wanted to be a TPM or an architect. And at this enterprise company, I couldn't really transition to those because they were hiring people already in role. Mm-hmm. So I kind of was stuck where I knew I needed something different, but I couldn't get there from here in that company. And at that time, I learned about a startup. And so that was wonderful for like 4 years. And so did that. And obviously the economy has changed. They started going through layoffs. I pivoted to another startup. They were in the same industry, so also got impacted by the economic downturn. And I realized like I need to take a step back and think again about what I care about growing in. And that moment of I came to a startup to kind of figure out, do I want to be a TPM or architect? I realized that I knew the answer to that now. Like I really wanted to be an architect. And so I started applying for enterprise companies as an architect with my startup experience and was able to get a job.
That's so great to hear. And just in your explanation of kind of what led you to where you are today. I heard so many of the pros and cons that I want to talk about. What I like about your story too is it's kind of the overarching theme of this podcast, which is really finding what it is that you want to do. And us changing our career paths, or, we go to college, we don't necessarily do what we went to college for. We change our careers. We're constantly looking how to adapt, how to grow. We have to do constant pivots based on how is the market going. And, your story just shows that, to where you are finally at a point right now where you're like, hey, I know what I want to do. I've learned all these things and this is really where I want to be. So I love it. And just some of the things that came up for me when you were talking about your experiences, like especially within startup space. The things that I know from my own experience that I really like about startups, I really enjoy finding order in chaos. The more crazy chaotic something is, the more excited I get about it. And I feel like in startup environments, you are able to go in and really make a bigger impact versus in a larger company, an enterprise company. You will be seen. That is one of the things that, I have as a pro. Did you feel that with your startup experience of like the impacts that you made?
That whole concept of controlling the chaos for me was a really critical learning that I enjoyed that in my career. So when I was a trainee and I pivoted to doing the implementations, one of the biggest things that the leader of that project told me was my job was to control the chaos. That's your number one and only job. And so I thought about that, as I moved through my career, on how my role, where I'm more comfortable in, is when I can see that. And then I have a chance to impact that either through process design, organizational design, project management by implementing a new feature that solves that. That brings me joy.
Yeah, and you have something you actually can see where the progress is being made. I love that too. That's one of my favorite things to see. I like checking off things on a list, like physically checking them off, not just, metaphorically. I like actually physically checking things off so that I can see what I've done.
Yeah, and I think you can't find those like places in an enterprise where they are doing change, management, some sort of program, but like an entire startup will be geared in that way.
Yeah.
In the sense of, I was at the startup through like Series B through Series D. And in 4 years, we were 4 different companies. And, you would get a meeting to start working. And then, by the time that you had gotten like the process and the cadence and the attendees all lined up and the inputs, the outputs clear and like how you communicated, like it would stop working. It's like, okay, like we got to take this process back through the ringer.
Yeah.
And everyone was hungry for that at a startup. Like you wouldn't survive at a startup if you're not comfortable in that constant reworking. And some people just are, that it's not a happy space for them. But like, if that is something where you're like, okay, like I'm comfortable seeing that this isn't working and introspecting and asking people for other ideas. And like, that's a good and healthy environment for you then.
Yeah. That's a really good call out there, because one thing I had on my list of things is not only about the bigger impact piece, but also the ever-changingness of the environment, which can be a pro or a con, depending on how you feel about that. Like you said, if you're having to rework something 10, 15 times, and then in a larger company, there may have already been that they've already gone through that, been there, done that type of thing. And then now they are more focused on maybe do it twice and we're done. If you wouldn't mind explaining, just for those who may not know much about startups and the series classes that they classify, if you wanted to kind of explain what that means.
Gosh, great question. And the series will help you a lot with like maturity of the company and also understanding like where they are in their maturity. Is that lining up with what you're looking for? So companies will start off early stealth mode. This could be, they're not even public yet, like in the sense of like doing any social media. And you could be the first engineer that joins a stealth mode company and get quite handsome equity package for that, but low pay. But like that might be really fun for you to be able to build something from literal scratch. Mm-hmm. Then you'll see like Series A, where it's like small funding, but you're generally like 20 to 50 people. You're able to work directly with the founder. You're able to really understand like the early leadership suite and wear a lot of hats. Series B was when I joined. I was employee 89. And, when I came off the elevator, my hiring manager was like, all right, I know you're interviewing for senior product manager, but we really need TPMs, but we don't have a TPM job family. So like, do you want to do a TPM job for this? And so like, that was kind of where we were at that moment. It was very squishy. Obviously, I was doing a lot of different things, from working with product marketing to product to ops to TPMing. That really appealed to me, to wear all those hats and go super broad. And I didn't know what I wanted to do next. So I got a chance to like literally do anything I wanted that my boss thought was also a problem. So like that was really empowering and supporting. But I would say like Series C, like things started getting more rigid. We had like levels, like started hiring in a lot of TPMs. Things got more codified, and like the ability for someone to go broad got narrowed. Mm-hmm. And like you had to be better if you're like a Series B person that like stretched to Series C, mm-hmm. at like recognizing like, oh, this thing that I liked doing before is now a full job and I'm going to give it to someone else to do. And that doesn't mean that I have any less of a job. Mm-hmm. I just get to do this other slice deeper and better. Some people don't like that. So we saw a lot of people actually just leave and go to another Series B startup. So like they wanted that level of maturity and freedom, and like they loved the firefight, and like we were putting in processes, and they're like, hold up, I didn't sign up for processes. I signed up for like the Wild West.
Yeah.
So it's really about being honest with yourself about what brings you joy. And, Series D is where, my experience kind of ends. But at that point, you're getting pretty enterprisey. Like you really should have product market fit. You should be looking at like IPOs. How do we have our security lined up?
I feel like I am more of a A-B series, mm-hmm. type of person, because mm-hmm. when it gets more into that fully grown process and starting to vet that out is where that kind of dwindles more, because then the chaos isn't there and the impact that you can make isn't there as much. And for me, those are pros. Also, like you said, one thing that I feel like it could be a pro or a con depending on the person is, I feel like in more enterprise companies, you're not going to wear as many hats versus a startup. And I feel like even in the various series of startups you're always going to wear a couple of hats. Like I wouldn't say just one, but I feel like in the larger companies, you really are designated a lane that you stay in. Mm-hmm. And there's a more rigid process in place that's like, whatever it is that your job title is that we said these are your, requirements, that's what you're doing. There's no going out of that.
Yeah. I mean, that breadth versus depth question has always been like so much of how I make my decision of what to do next in my career. The architect role is super broad. Like I get a chance to play in all areas of supply chain, planning it to delivering it. And that's extremely broad. Based on what I'm assigned, I'll have a chance to go very deep in that for segmented period of time. Mm-hmm. And then there'll be something else I'll have a chance to go deeper in. And so that for me kind of scratches my itch in an enterprise, mm-hmm. where I have breadth, but I can go deep, but I'm not stuck in that swim lane forever, because I just am way too curious to do something that deep for forever.
Yeah, you're moving on from this jack of all to now you're mastering something, mm-hmm. which in some ways, the, straight out of college, trying to figure out what you're wanting to do, startups are a really good place for you to figure that out, because it will give you so much of this wearing those many hats, being a jack of all, finding out about all things. But you may not ever get that opportunity to, once you find that one thing that you're just like, I love this. You may not get the opportunity, like I said, like to go deeper into it and learn all that you can about it. Me, I like being a jack of all more than a master of something. Mm-hmm. But sometimes I do get bored with it to where I'm just like, I do want a little bit more focus on something, but I feel like my brain just naturally is just like jumping all over the place anyway. So, but that could be a pro or con for some people. I don't know.
Oh, definitely. I think, startups allow you the chance to play as broad as you want, especially if you are in a place where the maturity level enables, some of that movement horizontally. It's definitely going to be a lot easier to say, oh, I see that team over there is doing something fun and I want to, consult or lend them my services for a quarter. Mm-hmm. Those are things that can happen in startups that are a lot more flexible than an enterprise.
When you mentioned earlier about when you worked for your first company and you were emailing and you didn't know that there were VPs, like in an enterprise company, you probably won't ever come in contact with a VP or get to know anyone much past your immediate manager. Versus in those startup companies, you're going to know everyone and they probably will know your name. It's a much more tight-knit atmosphere.
I mean, I sat next to our founder, in 2 different seating configurations, mm-hmm. Different offices at the startup. And at the second startup that I went to, I was getting like emails, from the CEO about, our numbers on the weekly business review. So definitely a much tighter relationship with leadership and a chance to get to learn from them, not just like hard skills that apply to your job, but also how does this person carry themselves in meetings? Mm-hmm. And that kind of chance to learn how they approach leadership.
And I know everyone that I've talked to that's worked in the startup environment, they always know their number, like of what they were when they were hired. Versus mm-hmm. when you talk about like enterprise company, you say, oh, I'm just another number. But it's funny in the way of, in a startup, you are a number because you remember that number, but it's for a totally different reason, which is it's more tight-knit. You knew exactly who was hired, before or after you, or 3 people down the line or whatnot. But in the larger companies, you will be, for lack of a better word, another number, but you won't know what number that is, I guess, is the way that it would be compared.
It means so much more context at a startup, your employee number, because there is, such rapid scale up. And also there is more turnover than there are at enterprises. People come in, they either realize like, I like Series B, but I don't like Series C, or wait, I didn't know what I was signing up for. This is way more thrashy than I thought. Or my job has now changed. They need a different job than I thought. There were times where we thought we were more mature than we were, and we hired roles that probably shouldn't have been hired until years later. And like people showed up and realized, oh, y'all don't need me yet. Your employee number gave so much more context into how much change you'd seen and how many iterations of that startup you'd evolved through.
Yeah, it is like it's almost like a badge of honor, when you can go into a place and be like, yeah, I was employee 2.
And I mean, it's funny also when I was doing my interviews at enterprises, like I realized like if you hadn't had the startup experience, they didn't understand that context at all in the interview. So like I had to find ways in the interview process at enterprises to pivot back to like explain what does employee 89 mean. Interviewing at an enterprise where, they might have had a team that's been around twice as long as our company. Like they don't understand that so intuitively. And so it was something kind of going back that I had to find ways to explain.
But that's a great point, because just in my own experience, right, going through a lot of interviews, and the larger companies are more regimented in how they're doing their interview process. So we would get on a call and it's like, okay, you're talking to your initial recruiter and it's like, all right, we're going to have this round here and you're going to do this with this person, you're going to do this with that person. And they have like all the steps right there. Versus startup, you get on a call with them and, they may be sitting there in their sweatpants or whatever and like very laid back. It's very, if you ask like, okay, how is your interview loops? What do those look like? What is the process? like, oh, we might make you talk to so-and-so. So depending on what you like and what you're more comfortable with.
Yeah. And I mean, definitely also how if you're interviewing for a job and you're like the first in job role, then that interview process probably isn't very dialed. They're like, yeah, we've never hired a QA engineer before. We don't know. Like we're kind of figuring this out. So you'll definitely see things like that. But that's a really cool opportunity to, like, if you are first enrolled at a startup, to define like what the parameters of your job should be and like set the template for people to come after you. So it can seem frightening going through the job interview process, but it's a huge opportunity on your resume to kind of explain, like, I stood up a job family.
I feel like there's a lot more flexibility. So that it all plays together. You've got the many hats, you can be more creative, you have a bigger impact, you have a lot more flexibility to do things.
And I'd say, as you're interviewing startups, to look at like, where are they in that whole maturity growth, and also like where did their leadership come through? My 2 startup experiences were heavily influenced by Amazon culture, in the sense that both had Amazon leadership come in and kind of implement different version of Amazon. And so there were parts that were flexible, but parts that actually gained like a lot of rigidity, over time. And so just kind of understanding like what in that interview process like is flexible. Like, okay, is it like start times and end times are more flexible? Those things, definitely it's more of a meritocracy, but also like where are the standards being implemented? What does leadership strive to do in their 30, 60, 90 from their goals perspective?
Setting those expectations up front, I think, is a big deal, especially in the startup environment, because if you're not one to be really malleable in your ways of doing things, it's probably not a good environment to be in. A lot of people I've talked to in my own experiences I've been at 2 startups, is I feel like startups do offer better benefits packages as far as compensation. You get the options for stock options. Sometimes they have options for buy-ins, and there's all these different kind of incentives to bring you in, because they really are looking for the best of the best to get them off the ground. Versus in the enterprise companies, it's a little bit more, it's like, okay, if you come from here in this area, we're going to pay you X amount of dollars, and we're really not going to go outside of that. You get X amount of days off, and we've got this 401k plan in place, and that's it, right? There's not as much incentives to pull too many people in that, could potentially grow the company, because that's really not their main goal. I feel like that is a good thing with the startup environment, but the con of that is, depending on the economy, depending on the market, depending on the industry that you're going into, it will get hit a lot harder. And there's a larger fall that you're going to take. In that case, with the startup environment, because it's small already to begin with, when there is a layoff, the people who are left behind have even more work, more hats that they have to wear than they did before.
I mean, it's definitely, there's a higher potential for upside, but like the downside is huge. As you're saying, most startups don't make it. Of the ones that make it, most get acquired. And so acquisition actually doesn't turn out, great options results. So you're really doing this for a moonshot that isn't very big, really grounding, like, okay, like the benefits that I use every day are good. Like I'm getting the career growth that I want. Like those things, like in the day to day, have to be what you make your decision on. And, are you working with people that you enjoy, especially like in early Series B, like you're hiring like mad. And I got the opportunity to bring over all of my best friends that I ever worked with, at different companies. And so I had my dream team of people that were my favorites to work with. And that makes a huge difference in my quality of life, that I had stakeholders that I'd worked with for, 15 years in different companies, all be my peers, and, an inbuilt mentorship program, people that I knew supported and empowered me. Like that meant a lot to me from like, intangible benefit. So I think there's obviously what you get on day one. There's also the ability to influence HR a lot more in a startup. Like these are the benefits we actually do want. These are what we are using. Like you won't see that in an enterprise. We were able to actually change things and say, like, we actually really value this thing, don't value that, and make those changes.
And that's another thing, like you get the opportunity to work probably in positions that you wouldn't be able to go. So like, let's say you wanted to be an architect, right? You can't just go to an enterprise company, apply for an architect position if you've never been one, because first of all, they're not even going to look at it if your titles of your jobs never had the word architect in there. They're just going to pass right over those. Versus in a startup company, they're going to take a little bit more time, look at your actual qualities, look at what you could bring to the table and say, hey, yes, I can see an architect in that person. So it's definitely, there's a pro there in that you will have opportunities to be able to grow in your career path a lot quicker versus that entry level in an enterprise company and having to work your way up that ladder. It's a lot harder.
100%. I think that I got an opportunity to try on both the TPM and the architect job at my startup and kind of say, what do I like about each one? Like what appeals to me? I got to try management. However, after going through 3 layoffs in less than 6 months, like I am a little too wounded to think about management for a while.
We'll put that in a con pile for the startups, because when you have to go through, usually with the layoffs, it is, or even when there is an acquisition. So if you're at a startup and then there becomes, they're acquired by someone, a lot of times what can happen is private equity firms come in and buy the companies, and then they will sell them to larger ones. And it's hard because you will have a lot of layoffs. And sometimes it's larger ones, and then sometimes it's just like a trickle here and there. And I've gone through that with companies I've worked for with the acquisition side of having to do that. And I was always happy that I was never in management. I mean, it was just difficult to be on the receiving end of a layoff, but it's also difficult to see the people going. And, there's that survivor's guilt that ends up happening on the other side.
It's definitely more susceptible to change. And, while the rocket ship is going up, it's so much fun. But if it inflects, these are, being at a startup, generally is more of a grind than being in an established company. So you've been in the trenches with these people. You know them a lot more than you would if you were in like a sustainment role in an enterprise in a non-change based role.
In larger companies, you have those, because everyone's kind of in their own lanes, you have these defined teams, they have defined set of things that they're going to do throughout the day. And coming in, like, who your resource is, who you need to go to for XYZ things. And there's probably somebody for just about everything you can think of, versus in that startup environment, you have that more close-knitness, and you have that where you are working with people that you're probably considering your friends at this point, but you may not have the proper resources always. It's a little bit harder to find kind of like that subject matter expert in a smaller pool.
Yeah. And also, where does scrappy become like a detriment? It's important to understand in a startup that I can stretch to X, but like I can't stretch to Y. And that's like, okay, to raise your hand and be like, I think this is a full-time job. Or do you realize like I'm supporting this falling down house? And like if I were to leave, like this whole corner will come down. And that's okay to call that out. And like good management, good leadership will be like, okay, let's figure out like how to extract you from that. Some discomfort is to be expected because it's like super squishy. Things kind of are coming and going as needs. But like if the needs stabilize and you're still like extended, it's no fun anymore. That's a problem, and a lot of people can just kind of get caught in this. I'm supposed to be grinding and I grind and like this task is my identity and like not hand it off. It's just being in sync with your management. And one of my leaders, I always used to say, okay, I know that hill's on fire, but like we are going to let that burn until Q4 when the rains come. Literally, that is not a priority. Like, do you agree? And just being okay with that. Like, this is the fire I'm focused on.
Like a semi-controlled burn, like you're controlling it in some ways, but at the same time, it's a little bit of a wildfire.
Like maybe it's an informative fire. Like maybe the next hill over needs to like step up their game, you know, and you're like, let them feel that. Or, you know, maybe, you know, there's natural boundaries, like, okay, there's a road on this side and a stream on this side and it can't spread. You kind of get where the metaphor is going. And like calling it out to you and your team are on the same page that you're not trying to solve that, because you have a lot of people in a startup who are trying to make things better and they might not know that's an intentional burn and like jump in. You're like, no, you're letting that happen.
I'm glad you said that, because I feel like personality types that come into this startup that's really like, yay, you know, I get to do these things. They are the ones that are just like, why can't we do all the things? Why aren't you doing why aren't you fixing this? Right? It's just this.
Yeah.
And I'm guilty of that. 100%. Like, I'm guilty of it, because I go into a place and I see chaos and I'm just like, there's something burning. And I was like, yay. Like, you know, I'm not going to get the marshmallows out. I'm the one trying to get the fire extinguisher. But over time, I will say, over time, I have learned to be a little bit more understanding, and especially with the tons of people that I'm talking to and on a daily basis and just networking and getting to know people for the podcast. It's just, I see that in myself of what I was doing and seeing where I kind of want to be. I don't necessarily want to be always the frontline firefighter. You know, I want to be that person, like you said, like saying, okay, hey, Q4, we're going to let it sit there for a little bit. Like, I would like to be on that side. So I'm kind of going through my own therapy of pulling myself out of that mindset.
Real therapy thing. You know, it is like a lot of people get fed with personal validation of making things better. And it can be kind of addictive to just be like, oh, I see a problem. I'm going to go solve a problem. I am good at solving problems. But like that tactical need, especially in like Series C and D, can burn you out. You know, how do you sustain that? You know, and how do you build in self-care? And either I need to delegate it or delete it or schedule it or just let it go. That was one of the things I learned the most in a startup, because a lot of that prioritization gets set for you in an enterprise and, you know, driven top down. And so you have to learn how to internalize or communicate those prioritization issues at a startup.
And that's a big deal, because the whole piece of like burnout and how do you sustain these things within that, you know, when you're wearing a lot of hats, and even though it's, for me, I say, oh my gosh, like this is the most exciting thing. I love chaos and all those things. It doesn't mean I don't get overwhelmed, right? So I am the type of person, I know there's a ton of people out there like this, where you do thrive on that, you know, hey, let's solve these things. And when you solve it and you fix it, it's just like, oh my gosh, I want to do that again. And that self-satisfaction is there. But more times than not, it has led me to some huge battles of burnout, to where then I'm going, what am I doing? Why do you do that? Questioning everything that is my being of, why are you like this? I feel like the time that I've had to reflect on this within being laid off and then really doing that deep dive into myself of what it is that I'm looking for and how I want to be as a person, I am happy to say, you know, I haven't been burnt out in the past 7 months, so that's good. If you could do anything in the world, money is not a factor. You know, we're not talking about like having to go back to school or anything like that, but just like your dream, absolute real dream job, what would it be?
Oh gosh. Well, buy a lavender farm or make a lavender farm about an hour from a ski resort and just ski and grow lavender. That sounds really lovely. Like, how much more relaxing can you get in your life than walk out into a lavender field where you just are surrounded by that beauty and scent?
Oh my God.
That sounded amazing. Also, was really good revenue per acre, which I learned at a startup was important to focus on revenue early. But yeah, that was the idea.
A lavender farm. I love it. I wonder if there are any lavender farmers out there. If there are, I would like to talk to you, because that sounds like a cool job.
Yeah, there are lavender farmers in Washington, actually. It's surprising. There's a whole
you know any of them? Send them my way. That sounds like a fun job, though. I mean, lavender, it is so relaxing, and then you said what, near a ski resort?
Yep. So that I could kind of go up to the ski resort, on days that we weren't harvesting lavender.
I love that. That's a good one. Well, Julia, this has been an amazing conversation. It's a topic that I've been wanting to talk about for a while now, just with a lot of the things going on with layoffs. You're hearing it about both startups and enterprise companies, and really a lot of people out there looking for jobs. Like, what are the pros and cons to each? So thank you so much for providing your feedback on that and having this chat with me. For anyone who's interested in getting in touch with Julia, I will have her contact information in the show notes. If you have questions about, the interview process for these types of companies, please let her know. And Julia, I wanted to see if you would like to join me back in the future on the podcast. We can talk about more startup versus enterprise type things, or, any type of topic, really. I would just love to have you back on and chat.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this. It's great to talk about both sides, and I think I learned a lot from both of them.
Super excited for you. So best of luck, and we will talk soon.
Oh, thank you, Stephanie. I appreciate it.
If you're interested in becoming a guest on my show, all the information on how to contact me is available in the show notes. Also, if you're enjoying the content and would like a shout out in an upcoming episode, a link in how you can support this podcast is available in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time.